On the morning of December 8, 1941, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor's shattered battleships, Private James McCarthy stood at attention in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Listening to his commanding officer read Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the words seemed to burn into his consciousness. Any officer who used contemptuous words against the President, Vice President, Congress, or senior military officials would face court-martial. What McCarthy didn't yet understand was that this wasn't merely a wartime. Reglatianti was a foundational principle of American military discipline rooted in the nation's earliest conflicts. It's designed to preserve the fragile chain of command that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. The prohibition against military criticism of civilian leadership stretched back to the Continental Army. When General George Washington himself had struggled to maintain discipline among soldiers who openly questioned Congress's failure to provide adequate supplies and pay. Washington understood what many revolutionaries initially didn't. An army that debates its orders is an army that cannot function. According to historical records from the National Archives, Washington issued general orders in 1776 explicitly forbidding mutinous expressions and demanding absolute respect for the Continental Congress. Despite that body's frequent incompetence and neglect of his starving troops at Valley Forge, by the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency in 1933, this principle had been codified through more than a century of military jurisprudence. The Articles of War, adopted in 1806 and revised multiple times thereafter, specifically outlined the boundaries of acceptable speech for soldiers. Article 60, which dealt with mutiny and sedition, and Article 61, which covered creating disaffection among troops, provided commanders with powerful tools to silence dissent. These weren't arbitrary restrictions imposed by authoritarian leaders. They emerged from hard lessons learned on battlefields where hesitation, debate, or divided loyalty had cost American lives. Roosevelt himself had witnessed the destructive potential of military-civilian friction during World War I. When he'd served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson, have observed how public disagreements between generals and civilian leadership had undermined public confidence and hampered the war effort. General Leonard Wood, for instance, had openly criticized Wilson's preparedness policies, creating political firestorms that distracted from military necessity. Roosevelt remembered these episodes when war threatened again in the late 1930s, understanding that the coming conflict would require unprecedented unity of purpose. The strategic reasoning behind these restrictions was brutally simple. Modern warfare demanded rapid, coordinated responses to constantly changing battlefield conditions. A soldier who questioned whether General Douglas MacArthur's strategy in the Philippines was sound, or whether Roosevelt's decision to prioritize the European theater over the Pacific made sense, wasn't engaged in democratic discourse. He was introducing doubt into a system that required absolute certainty in execution, even when planning remained flexible. As military historian John Keegan would later write in The Mask of Command, armies function through directed telescope of authority, where orders flow downward without philosophical debate at each level. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed these abstract legal principles into immediate life-or-death necessities. Within days, America would mobilize millions of civilians into military service, creating the largest armed force in the nation's history. Within 3 months of Pearl Harbor, by March 1942, more than 2 million American men had enlisted or been drafted into military service. The War Department faced an unprecedented challenge, transforming factory workers, farmers, and shop clerks into disciplined soldiers who would follow orders under the most horrific conditions imaginable. At training facilities across the nation, drill sergeants hammered home a fundamental lesson that seemed to contradict everything these young men had learned about American democracy in the military. You don't debate, you obey. Captain Robert Harrison, a training officer at Fort Benning, Georgia, explained the philosophy to new recruits with stark clarity. You can vote for who you want in peacetime, but in war, there's only one vote that matters: the commander's. This wasn't mere authoritarianism. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of how military organizations functioned under extreme stress. Harrison had studied the German army's collapse in World War I, when revolutionary councils of soldiers had begun debating orders, effectively destroying military effectiveness from within. The German Navy's mutiny at Kiel in November 1918 had sparked the revolution that toppled the Kaiser, but it had also left Germany defenseless and humiliated at the negotiating table. Roosevelt and his military commanders, particularly Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, worried constantly about maintaining morale without permitting the kind of griping that could metastasize into genuine insubordination. Marshall, perhaps the most respected military figure of his generation, believed deeply in civilian control of the military, but he also understood that control required discipline throughout the ranks. In a memorandum dated April 15, 1942, Marshall wrote to all theater commanders, emphasizing that, while soldiers should have channels to express legitimate grievances about conditions, criticism of strategic decisions, questioning of command authority, or disparagement of civilian leadership, represents a fundamental breach of military order that cannot be tolerated. The practical application of these principles played out in countless incidents across training camps and combat zones. When Private Samuel Goldman at Camp Edwards in Massachusetts was overheard telling fellow soldiers that Roosevelt doesn't know what the hell he's doing, getting us into a war we can't win, he found himself facing a summary court-martial within 72 hours. The proceeding was swift and decisive: 14 days of hard labor and forfeiture of 2 months' pay. Goldman's punishment wasn't about suppressing free speech in a constitutional sense. It was about preventing the spread of defeatism that could undermine unit cohesion at a moment when American forces were experiencing devastating defeats in the Philippines and across the Pacific. The legal framework supporting these prosecutions drew from multiple sources. Article 88 of the Articles of War specifically prohibited commissioned officers from using contemptuous words against the President, Congress, or superior officers. The general article provided a catch-all provision to prosecute conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. According to research by military law scholar Jonathan Lurie, more than 3,000 soldiers faced courts-martial between 1942 and 1945 for offenses related to disrespectful or insubordinate speech. Though many of these cases involved broader disciplinary issues beyond simple criticism, but the restrictions weren't absolute or mindlessly applied. Marshall and other thoughtful commanders recognized the difference between destructive criticism and legitimate concerns about tactics, conditions, or leadership competence. They established inspector general channels where soldiers could report genuine problems without fear of retaliation. By November 1942, when American forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, the theoretical principles of military discipline confronted battlefield reality. The first major American ground offensive in the European-African theater would test whether armies built on democratic values could maintain the necessary answers. Discipline to fight effectively against battle-hardened German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. What soldiers learned in the sands of Morocco and Algeria would reshape their understanding of why criticism of commanders wasn't just prohibited, was potentially fatal. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Briggs, serving with the 1st Infantry Division near Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, witnessed firsthand the consequences of command, confusion, and second-guessing. In February 1943, American forces suffered a humiliating defeat when German panzers smashed through inadequately prepared defensive positions, sending thousands of American soldiers retreating in disarray. The battle exposed serious deficiencies in American training, equipment coordination, and leadership. According to the official U.S. Army History Northwest Africa, Seizing the Initiative in the West by George Howe, published by the Army's Center of Military History, the defeat stemmed partly from confusion about command relationships between American and British forces, but also from inexperienced American units that hadn't yet learned to function as disciplined teams under fire. In the aftermath of Kasserine Pass, an insidious dynamic emerged in some American units. Soldiers who had witnessed the chaotic retreat began openly questioning whether their commanders knew what they were doing. Junior officers criticized General Lloyd Fredendall's decisions to scatter his forces and establish his command post 50 miles behind the front lines. These criticisms weren't wrong. Fredendall would be relieved of command, but the act of subordinates publicly debating their commander's competence while still in contact with the enemy created dangerous uncertainty. Companies and battalions fight effectively only when soldiers trust that someone has a plan, even if that plan isn't perfect. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, faced a delicate balancing act. He needed to remove incompetent commanders while simultaneously maintaining the principle that orders must be followed without public debate. In March 1943, Eisenhower replaced Fredendall with General George S. Patton, Jr., whose aggressive leadership style and theatrical presence would transform the demoralized American forces. But Eisenhower also issued clear guidance to all commanders about maintaining discipline regarding criticism of leadership. In a directive circulated to all American units, Eisenhower acknowledged that mistakes had been made, but emphasized that our strength lies not in perfection, but in our ability to correct errors through proper channels, while maintaining unity of purpose in the face of the enemy. Patton himself became both an enforcer and, ironically, a violator of these principles. His famous slapping incidents when he physically struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue at field hospitals in Sicily. In August 1943, triggered a crisis that illustrated the complexities of military speech restrictions. Newspaper correspondent Drew Pearson broke the story in November 1943, creating a public scandal. Patton had violated fundamental principles of military leadership by abusing soldiers, yet the story's publication also raised questions about whether military discipline could survive public criticism of generals. Roosevelt personally intervened to save Patton's career, calculating that the general's tactical brilliance outweighed his personal failings. But the president also used the incident to reinforce the principle that criticism of military leadership needed to flow through proper channels rather than through public denunciation. While American forces in Europe operated under relatively clear command structures, the Pacific theater presented unique challenges to military discipline and the prohibition on criticizing leadership. By mid-1943, two powerful personalities, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanded separate but overlapping campaigns against Japan, creating inevitable tensions that occasionally spilled into public view. How the War Department managed these command rivalries while maintaining the principle of unified military purpose revealed the sophisticated thinking behind speech restrictions in wartime. MacArthur himself represented a paradox at the heart of American civil-military relations. A brilliant strategist and theatrical commander who inspired fierce loyalty among his troops, MacArthur also possessed an enormous ego that occasionally led him to the edge of insubordination toward Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The general's public statements often contained barely veiled criticism of the European First strategy that allocated resources to fighting Germany before concentrating fully on Japan. In April 1943, MacArthur told reporters in Brisbane, Australia, that the Pacific has become a secondary theater due to strategic decisions made in Washington, a statement that clearly implied criticism of Roosevelt's priorities without explicitly condemning the president. Roosevelt tolerated MacArthur's borderline insubordination for several reasons, all of which illuminated why the rules about military criticism existed, but required nuanced application. First, MacArthur was immensely popular with the American public and with congressional Republicans, making him politically dangerous to confront directly. Second, MacArthur's criticisms, while pushing boundaries, didn't directly undermine operational security or unit morale in ways that would damage the war effort. Third, and most importantly, MacArthur maintained absolute discipline within his own command. His soldiers weren't permitted to criticize him or question strategy, even as he sometimes challenged Washington's decisions. The contrast between what MacArthur could say and what his soldiers could say illustrated a fundamental principle. Senior commanders operated in the political strategic realm, where some debate about resource allocation, grand strategy was necessary and appropriate. Enlisted men and junior officers operated in the tactical operational realm, where questioning orders could get people killed. Staff Sergeant William Bradford, serving with the 32nd Infantry Division in New Guinea, learned this distinction when he was court-martialed in July 1943 for telling his squad that MacArthur is sending us on suicide missions so he can get his name in the papers. Bradford's criticism, unlike MacArthur's carefully calibrated public statements, directly undermined his unit's willingness to execute dangerous but necessary missions. The Pacific Theater also highlighted how criticism could compromise operational security. In the island-hopping campaign that characterized the American advance toward Japan, detailed planning and surprise were essential to minimizing casualties. When sailors aboard the USS Enterprise discussed their skepticism about upcoming operations within earshot of civilian contractors in Pearl Harbor in September 1943, They inadvertently revealed details about target dates and objectives that could have reached Japanese intelligence. A subsequent investigation led to disciplinary action not primarily for criticizing Admiral Nimitz's strategy, but for the security breach that criticism facilitated. Combat correspondent Robert Sherrod, covering the Marine assault on Tarawa in November 1943, documented the horrific casualties that resulted when Marines had to wade through 500 yards of shallow water under withering Japanese fire. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the prohibition on military criticism of Roosevelt and senior commanders faced new pressures from an unexpected direction. The home front began questioning military leadership in ways that complicated the government's efforts to maintain both military discipline and civilian morale. The intersection of military speech restrictions and civilian free speech created tensions that revealed the deeper purposes behind regulations that many Americans found increasingly difficult to accept. In January 1944, the mother of Private Edward Sullivan, killed during the fighting in Italy, published an open letter in the Chicago Tribune criticizing General Mark Clark's leadership of the Fifth Army and implicitly questioning Roosevelt's decision to invade Italy rather than concentrating forces for a cross-channel invasion of France. Margaret Sullivan's letter ignited a firestorm of debate about whether families of soldiers had the right to criticize military strategy when their sons were dying for those strategies. The War Department faced a dilemma. Prosecuting a grieving mother was politically impossible, but allowing her criticisms to stand unchallenged might encourage similar public questioning of military leadership. Roosevelt addressed the issue in a press conference on February 8, 1944, carefully distinguishing between civilian and military speech. In our democracy, the president explained, Mrs. Sullivan has every right to express her views, her grief, and her anger. But her son, when he took the oath of service, accepted certain restrictions on his own speech that are essential to military effectiveness. This is not a contradiction, but rather a recognition that soldiers must sometimes surrender certain individual rights to serve the collective security. Roosevelt's formulation attempted to preserve both democratic values and military necessity. It satisfied neither critics who saw the speech restrictions as un-American, nor military professionals who worried that the president's acknowledgement of civilian criticism rights might encourage soldiers to have their families speak for them. The issue became more acute as casualties mounted in preparation for the Normandy invasion. By spring 1944, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers crowded into bases across southern England, waiting for D-Day. The stress of anticipation, combined with frustration over what many soldiers perceived as British criticism of American fighting qualities after earlier engagements, created a volatile atmosphere. Captain James Forrester, a company commander with the 4th Infantry Division, reported to his superiors that soldiers were increasingly expressing doubts about General Omar Bradley's competence and questioning whether the invasion plan was sound. The military's response to this growing criticism revealed how seriously commanders took the threat of eroding discipline, rather than simply court-martialing soldiers for disrespectful speech. Bradley and other invasion commanders ordered a program of briefings that explained the invasion plan in sufficient detail to give soldiers confidence without compromising operational security. The approach reflected Marshall's belief that soldiers fought most effectively when they understood their mission's purpose, even if they couldn't question its wisdom. As military psychologist Samuel Stuffer later documented in The American Soldier Combat and Its Aftermath, published in 1949, units with higher morale and better discipline were those where soldiers felt their commanders had been honest with them about risks and objectives. The pre-invasion period also saw the military establish more robust systems for soldiers to express concerns through appropriate channels. Inspector General investigations into complaints about training, equipment, or leadership increased dramatically in the months before D-Day, allowing soldiers to vent frustrations without undermining command authority. These investigations sometimes led to significant change. Changes poorly designed landing craft were modified, inadequate training programs were overhauled, and occasionally incompetent officers were relieved. On June 6, 1944, as the largest amphibious invasion in history crashed against the beaches of Normandy, the importance of disciplined obedience to orders became viscerally terribly clear. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, landing on Omaha Beach with the 116th Infantry Regiment, later recalled how the first waves of soldiers were cut down by German machine gun fire before they could reach the seawall. In those moments of chaos and horror, when officers were killed and plans collapsed into confusion, the soldiers who survived and advanced weren't those who questioned whether the invasion strategy was flawed. They were those who followed the last order they'd heard, moved forward, and adapted to circumstances without debate. The Normandy campaign revealed both the necessity and the limitations of prohibiting criticism of commanders. General Bradley's initial plans for breaking out of the hedgerow country of Normandy, bogged down and costly, grinding combat that some historians later judged to be poorly conceived. British military historian Max Hastings, in his book Overlord, D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, published in 1984, argued that American commanders initially underestimated the difficulty of fighting in the bocage terrain and failed to develop appropriate tactics quickly enough. But in June and July 1944, American soldiers couldn't know whether their commanders' strategies were optimal. They could only execute orders and trust that someone with a broader view understood what needed to be done. The historical record demonstrates why the prohibition existed and why it mattered. Armies function through hierarchical command structures that require rapid execution of orders without philosophical debate at every level. Soldiers who question whether their commanders are competent, whether strategic decisions are wise, or whether political leaders deserve support, introduce hesitation and divided loyalty into organizations that must act decisively under extreme stress. As General George Marshall understood, the battlefield is not a debating society. It's a place where lives depend on thousands of individuals functioning as a coordinated whole, which requires subordinating individual judgment to collective purpose. But the World War II experience also revealed the costs of restricting military speech. The prohibition on criticizing commanders sometimes protected incompetent leaders like General Lloyd Fredendell, whose failures at Kasserine Pass cost American lives. Intelligence officers who doubted optimistic assessments before the Battle of the Bulge may have hesitated to voice concerns forcefully enough. Knowing that questioning senior commanders' judgments could damage their careers, the line between destructive criticism and necessary accountability proved difficult to define in practice, even when the principle seemed clear in theory. Contemporary military institutions have attempted to address these tensions by distinguishing between different kinds of speech in different contexts. Service members retain full First Amendment rights when speaking as private citizens on matters of public concern unrelated to their military duties. They can vote, express political opinions in private conversations, and participate in democratic discourse like any other Americans. But they cannot use their military positions to lend authority to partisan political statements, cannot publicly disparage civilian or military leadership, and cannot engage in speech that undermines good order and discipline. The digital age has complicated these distinctions enormously. Social media platforms give every soldier the potential to broadcast opinions to millions of people instantly, making the line between private speech and public criticism increasingly blurred. A sergeant who posts on social media criticizing the president's foreign policy might argue he's exercising First Amendment rights as a private citizen, while the military might view this as using his position to undermine civilian leadership. The military justice system continues wrestling with how to apply principles developed in the 1940s to technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to Roosevelt and Marshall. The deeper question raised by the World War II experience concerns how democracies can maintain effective military forces without creating an authoritarian culture within those forces. The prohibition on military criticism of civilian leaders serves democracy by ensuring that elected officials control military policy rather than generals becoming independent political actors. But that same prohibition requires soldiers to surrender certain democratic rights: freedom of speech, the right to question authority, the ability to dissent from policies they consider wrong. This paradox that defending democracy requires military personnel to accept limitations on their own democratic rights remains as challenging today as it was in 1941 when the United States entered World War II. James McCarthy, who returned from the war and lived until 1998, occasionally reflected on his military service during interviews with local historians. Asked whether he resented the restrictions on his speech during the war, McCarthy offered a perspective shaped by having watched friends die in combat at the time. Some of it seemed unfair. But I came to understand that an army isn't a town hall meeting. Lives depended on people following orders, and that meant trusting the chain of command, even when you didn't understand or agree with everything. Was every order right? No. Were all our commanders brilliant? Definitely not. But the alternative, an army where everyone debates everything, wouldn't have won the war. The historical importance of the prohibition on military personnel, criticizing their leaders, lies not in its perfection but in its recognition of a fundamental truth about military organizations. They require a different balance between individual freedom and collective obligation than civilian society does. Roosevelt and his military commanders understood this during World War II, even as they struggled with its implications and made mistakes in its application. Their legacy, encoded in Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and reinforced through decades of military tradition, remains essential to American democracy, precisely because it accepts that defending freedom sometimes requires limiting it, and that maintaining civilian control of the military requires military personnel to restrain their own voices in service of larger constitutional principles. Whether future generations will preserve this balance, or whether changing social values and technologies will force fundamental reconsideration of these restrictions, remains an open question that speaks to the enduring tension between military necessity and democratic ideals in American life.